The rain drummed softly against the roof as Ethan pulled his suitcase through the front door of his uncle's house. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee, a contrast to the cold drizzle outside. It had been years since he last visited, yet nothing seemed to have changed, except for one thing. Aunt Rebecca. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her honey-blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her figure wrapped in a fitted cardigan. Her hazel eyes widened slightly before settling into a warm smile. "Ethan," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You've grown." He smiled, setting his suitcase down. "It's been a while." She walked closer, her scent, subtle vanilla and something else, something intoxicating, drifting toward him. "James mentioned you'd be staying for a few weeks." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Needed a change of scenery. Rebecca nodded, but there was something in her gaze, something unreadable. A deep voice broke the moment. "Ethan." Uncle James entered the room, his presence filling the space. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp suit despite the late hour. He clapped Ethan on the back. "Good to see you, kid. Make yourself at home." Ethan forced a smile. "Thanks, Uncle James." James turned to Rebecca, already distracted. "Did you send those emails for the firm?" Rebecca's expression flickered. "Yes, I handled them this afternoon. But I have another set coming in later. I'll need them sorted by morning." Rebecca simply nodded, her gaze dropping. Ethan noticed the way her shoulders tensed, the way she twisted her wedding band around her finger. Dinner was a quiet affair. James barely touched his food before excusing himself, already on a call. That left Ethan and Rebecca alone at the table. "He works a lot, huh?" Ethan said, stabbing at his food. Rebecca gave a small laugh, though there was little humor in it. More than ever. Pause settled between them. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving a hush over the house. Ethan glanced at Rebecca, at the way she absent-mindedly traced the rim of her wine glass. "You must be exhausted," she said after a moment. "The guest room's ready. You remember where it is?" He nodded. Thanks." She stood, gathering the plates, but as she reached for his, their fingers brushed. It was brief, so brief it could have been nothing. But Ethan felt it. And so did she. Ethan awoke early, the house still shrouded in pre-dawn quiet. He stretched, running a hand through his hair before heading for the bathroom. The warm spray of the shower was welcome against his skin, washing away the stiffness of sleep. Lost in thought, he didn't hear the soft creak of the door, didn't register the faint gasp. By the time he turned, the damage was done. Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, lips slightly parted. For a moment, neither of them moved. The steam curled around them, blurring the lines between what was appropriate and what was dangerously close to something else. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were in here." Her voice was unsteady. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before slipping out, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan exhaled, pressing his palms against the tiled wall. His heart pounded, his mind racing. Had been a mistake. A simple accident. And yet, the way she had looked at him, that lingering second too long, told him something else entirely. This was only the beginning. Ethan avoided Rebecca for most of the morning. He lingered in his room longer than necessary, scrolling absently through his phone, replaying the moment in the bathroom over and over. It had been an accident. An unfortunate, embarrassing accident. But the way she had looked at him, the way her breath had hitched, that was not accidental. By the time he finally stepped into the kitchen, the scent of coffee filled the air. Rebecca stood at the counter, her back to him, stirring a cup slowly, lost in thought. She must have sensed him because she turned before he could say anything. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension. "Morning," she said finally, her voice composed but quieter than usual. "Morning," Ethan replied, leaning against the counter. An awkward silence settled between them. Then Rebecca cleared her throat, setting the spoon down with a soft clink. "About earlier." Ethan tensed, gripping the edge of the counter. "It was nothing," he said quickly, almost too quickly. She studied him, her hazel eyes searching his face. Then she gave a small, breathy laugh. "Right. Nothing." She turned back to her coffee, but the energy in the room had shifted. Ethan could feel it in the way her fingers tightened around the handle of the mug, in the way she lingered just a little too long before walking away. "Nothing." Then why did it feel like everything? Later that afternoon, Uncle James returned home earlier than expected. He strode through the door, phone pressed to his ear, barking instructions to someone on the other end. Rebecca straightened immediately, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Ethan watched the way James barely acknowledged her, how he tossed his briefcase onto the couch and loosened his tie without so much as a glance in her direction. Rebecca set a glass of water on the table beside him. "Long day," James grunted, nodding as he continued texting. "Investors are a nightmare." She waited a beat, then. "I was thinking we could go out tonight. Maybe that little place by the harbor." James barely looked up. "Not tonight. Too much going on." Rebecca pressed her lips together, exhaling softly. "You always say that." Her voice was even, controlled, but Ethan caught the slight tremor beneath it. James sighed, finally glancing at her. "I'm sorry, Beck. You know how things are right now." She smiled small tight. "Right." Ethan watched the exchange, an uncomfortable weight settling in his chest. The room felt colder, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the windows. James turned to him, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "What about you, Ethan? You keeping busy?" Ethan forced a smirk. "Trying." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Enjoy it while you can. The real world catches up eventually." Rebecca stood abruptly. "I'll start dinner." She disappeared into the kitchen without another word. Ethan hesitated, then followed. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables filled the silence as Ethan leaned against the counter, watching Rebecca work. Her movements were precise, mechanical, but there was a tightness to her jaw, a quiet storm behind her eyes. "You okay?" he asked. She let out a small laugh. Empty, humorless. "I'm fine." He didn't believe her. She exhaled, setting the knife down. "James wasn't always like this, you know." Ethan tilted his head, waiting. "He used to be," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Present." Ethan swallowed. "People change." Rebecca's gaze lifted to meet his. They do." Another silence. This one heavier. Ethan should have left it there, should have turned and walked away. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for a stray carrot on the cutting board, popping it into his mouth. "Need any help?" Rebecca watched him for a moment, something flickering behind her eyes. Then, slowly, she handed him a knife. Their fingers brushed, just a whisper of contact. Breath. Pause. Then she pulled away, and Ethan knew. This wasn't nothing at all. It was the beginning of something dangerous. The evening air was thick with humidity, the remnants of the afternoon rain clinging to the world outside. Inside, the house felt impossibly still. James had retreated to his office after dinner, shutting the door with a kind of finality that told Rebecca she wouldn't see him again until morning. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, aimlessly swirling the last of his wine in its glass. Across from him, Rebecca stacked the plates, her movements slow, deliberate. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them felt heavier than words ever could. He should go to bed. That would be the smart thing to do. Instead, when Rebecca turned to rinse the dishes, Ethan rose from his seat. "I'll dry," he said, reaching for a towel. She hesitated before nodding, stepping aside just enough to let him stand next to her. The proximity was too close, too intimate for something as mundane as washing dishes. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the subtle scent of vanilla, and something deeper, something uniquely hers. For a while, they worked in silence, But the air between them crackled with a charge neither of them acknowledged. Then Rebecca spoke. I used to love nights like this. Ethan glanced at her. Like what? She rinsed a plate, handing it to him. Quiet. Simple. She sighed. James and I used to cook together. We'd drink too much wine, talk about everything and nothing. Ethan wiped the plate, placing it on the rack. What changed? Rebecca gave a small, humorless laugh. Work. Life. Priorities. He paused. Me. Ethan frowned. You. She shook her head as if shaking off the thought. Never mind. But he didn't want to let it go. Not this time. You think it's your fault? He asked. Rebecca turned to him then, her eyes locking onto his. For a second, neither of them moved. I don't know what I think anymore, she admitted. Her voice was soft, but there was something raw beneath it. Something vulnerable. Something Ethan wasn't sure he had the strength to ignore. The moment stretched too long, the air between them growing impossibly thin. Rebecca's breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for Ethan to notice. He should step back. But he didn't. Instead, his hand moved, instinctive, unthinking, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Rebecca didn't pull away. Her lips parted slightly, her breath warm against his skin. Heartbeat. Hesitation. Then the distance between them disappeared. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the reality of it. But then something shifted. Rebecca made a quiet sound in the back of her throat, and suddenly, restraint no longer existed. Her hands curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. Ethan responded in kind, deepening the kiss, his fingers pressing against the curve of her waist. It was reckless, was wrong, and neither of them stopped. When they finally broke apart, Rebecca's breathing was uneven, her eyes clouded with something unreadable. This shouldn't have happened, she whispered, but she didn't move away. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. I know. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then footsteps echoed down the hall. They jerked apart just as James appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Still up? He asked, glancing between them. Rebecca turned quickly, reaching for a towel. Just finishing up, she said, her voice perfectly even. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. James nodded absently, rubbing his temples. Heading to bed. Long day tomorrow. Rebecca nodded, her back still to him. I'll be up soon. James left without another word, and the house fell into silence once more. Ethan turned to Rebecca, expecting regret, maybe even anger. But when she finally faced him, her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over. Not even close.